Come, come hoof and trunk and tail and horn and paw and wing and claw. Come bird and reptile, mammal born, all full of nature's law. Bring bark and crow and ribbit too, and silent stare and hiss. Bring purr and trill and warble too, and voice no ear can miss. We gather here, each life and all, to celebrate and sing, to honor creature large and small. 'Tis holiness we bring. Our opening thought comes from Murray Bookchin and his writing, Urbanization Without Cities, The Rise and Decline of Citizenship. Bookchin writes, the word moral must be repeated, not as rhetoric to match the claims of reaction, but as the felt spiritual underpinnings of a new social vision. It must be repeated not as a part of a patronizing sermon, but as a living practice that people incorporate into their personal lives and their communities. The vacuity and triviality of life today must be filled precisely by those visionary ideals that sustain the human side of life as well as its material side, or else the coordinates by which the future should be guided will totally disappear in that commodity-oriented world we call the marketplace of ideas. The more serious indecency of this marketplace is that these ideals will be turned into objects, mere commodities that will lack even the value of things we need to sustain us. They will become the mere ornaments needed to garnish an inherently anti-human and anti-ecological society that threatens to undermine moral integrity as such and the simple social amenities that foster human intercourse. Our next reading comes from Wendell Berry from his work, Bringing It to the Table on Farming and Food. We had entered an era of limitlessness, or the illusion thereof, and this in itself is a sort of wonder. My grandfather lived in a life of limits, both suffered and strictly observed in a world of limits. I learned much of that world from him and others, and then I changed. I entered the world of labor-saving machines and a limitless, cheap fossil fuel. It would take me years of reading, thought, and experience to learn again that in this world, limits are not only inescapable, but indispensable. Our next reading comes from James Briding from his work, Too Small to Fail, Why Small Nations Outperform Larger Ones and How They Are Reshaping the World. He writes, nations do not spontaneously organize themselves to achieve higher Human Development Index rankings or higher test scores for their students or lower CO2 emissions. Food does not fall on their plates, clothes on their backs, or roofs over their heads. Well-being and progress towards it is what begs a better explanation. Almost all discussion of salvation in our culture revolves around salvation of individual persons. And for the most part, this individual salvation is primarily focused on a salvation that leads us to some eternal reward in another world like heaven, even though we might experience some positive consequences from salvation in this life. If nothing else, the assurance that we will go to the good place after we die, and the joy of knowing our sins have been forgiven, and that we won't spend eternity in the bad place. The emphasis on individual salvation in religions like Christianity has been unfortunate given that the teachings of the Hebrew prophets and the teachings of Jesus were as much or more about the community as they were about the individual person. The prophets and Jesus proclaimed that love is to be expressed in community, that justice entails good news for the poor and liberation of the oppressed, and that we must care for and protect the most vulnerable among us in community. Their teachings are much more than just individual salvation or even individual transformation. They call for the transformation of society towards love and justice in community. It's not surprising that once Christianity was captured and controlled by the Roman Empire, that the focus would shift almost exclusively to individual salvation. If people are convinced that the only way to avoid eternal suffering is to do what the imperial church tells them to do, it is much easier to control the masses for the sake of maintaining order and obedience within the empire. The focus on individual salvation is also a way to maintain the status quo, and the status quo is often one of injustice within society. If people are focused solely on their individual salvation in the next life, they tend to be less concerned about social transformation in this life. Our ultimate reward is seen as being in heaven or the assurance thereof, rather than in bringing about systemic change for justice in this world. In our context of the United States, there have been movements that have pushed back at this overly individual focus on salvation. The movement to abolish slavery, the social gospel movement, the suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the movement for the rights of persons who are LGBTQ2S+, have all pointed to a vision of social salvation and social change, and not just the salvation of our individual souls in the sweet by and by. But until very recently, even our community-focused and socially focused views of salvation have been anthropocentric, which is just a fancy way of saying human-centered. We have focused on humanity, often to the neglect of non-human life and our larger ecological community. It is past time to expand our understanding of salvation to include all life and all of the ecosystems in which we live. It is time to work for ecological salvation. The human-centered approach is difficult to escape. I often hear sincere climate justice advocates say this. They say that since it is likely that life on Earth will find a way to come back, like it has in previous mass extinction events, that the real or primary reason to address climate crisis or climate change is for the survival of the human species. There's some truth in this assertion. Yes, life will likely find a way to come back as it has before, but if we are only addressing the climate crisis to save ourselves and our species, then we fail to see the real loss, the real suffering that we are also causing our non-human siblings of life on this planet. What we are doing to the planet is having and will continue to have a profound impact on non-human life. And the suffering we are causing non-human life is wrong in itself, even if it did not also threaten the survival of the human species. If we take out ourselves through climate inaction, we will take out much of currently existing non-human life with us. And that life matters. It matters for its own sake. The way forward to a deep commitment to climate justice is a recognition that we are all persons in a greater ecological community, and the other members of our ecological community also have inherent worth that ought to be respected. Yes, we are fighting for the survival of the human species, but we are also fighting for the survival and for the flourishing of so much more than ourselves. It is difficult for some of us to think and act in non-anthropocentric ways, non-human-centered ways. Most of us have been conditioned to view the world in dualistic and hierarchical ways, with humans separate from and on top of nature. I know that's what I heard when I was young, not from my parents, but from so many others around me in my religious community. This attitude is one of the primary reasons that our human survival and the survival of other forms of life are now threatened. The way forward to radical systemic change for a livable climate is to realize that we are not just saving ourselves. We are cooperating within our ecological communities to save as much life, both human and non-human, as we possibly can. In this attitude of love for the other members of our ecological community, we might even find a deeper salvation as members of the community of all life than we ever thought possible. We are now living in what many persons are calling the Anthropocene epoch, a time in which all aspects of the earth are influenced greatly by human activity. This human activity, especially in its industrialized and fossil fuel-dependent expressions, is often driven by corporate greed and is contributing to the sixth great extinction on Earth. The previous 5 great extinction events are marked by thin layers in the fossil record that bear witness to how rapidly life on Earth can be diminished. But the catastrophic events that produced the massive reduction of species seen in those layers were not caused by the actions of one species. The layer of extinction that we are leaving to the fossil record is a layer of death of our own making. If we do not move quickly from the Anthropocene epoch to the Ecozoic epoch, in which we see ourselves as part of the house of all living beings, which is what Ecozoic means, if we don't do that, the fossil record of the Anthropocene will show how quickly a highly intelligent yet highly irresponsible species can wreak havoc for all life on Earth. And if intelligent life ever evolves again and somehow finds the thin, catastrophic layer of our contribution to the geological record, they might very well respond with their version of WTF. The good news is that there is still some hope that we can move from the Anthropocene epoch to the Ecozoic epoch instead of continuing the sixth great extinction. But it cannot be an unrealistic hope that leads us to complacency. It must be a realistic hope based in action for systemic change that helps us recognize the fierce urgency of now. I leave us with some words of realistic hope from the climate scientist who also works in Texas, although she's from Canada. Her name is Catherine Hayhoe, and she writes the following words in her recent book, Saving Us, a Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World. She writes, "Science tells us it's too late to avoid all of the impacts of climate change. Some are already here today. Others are inevitable because of the past choices we've made, and that can make us afraid. Science also tells us that much of what we do is actively contributing to the problem, from turning on our lights to what we eat for lunch. That makes us feel guilt. But the research I do is clear. It is not too late to avoid the most serious and dangerous impacts. Our choices will determine what happens. The future we collectively face will be forged by our own actions. Climate change stands between us and a breathtaking, exhilarating future. We cannot afford to be paralyzed by fear or shame. We must act with power, love, and a sound mind. Together, we can save ourselves. Our parting thought comes from Paul Pullman, who writes, "Our current economic system has two fundamental weaknesses. It's based on unlimited growth on a finite planet, and it benefits a small number of people, not everyone.